Hello, this is going to be a video about constructors and initialization lists. I wanted to start with a little bit of preamble about creating and initializing variables generally. Let me go ahead and make that full screen. Okay, so we can certainly create a variable this way, and it's very common to want to initialize the variable to a particular value at the point in time where you're creating it, and the method we've seen so far is by simply having the assignment operator and then the actual value. There's a second way of initializing that isn't seen as frequently but is equally valid, and this will come into play in a few minutes, so that's why I wanted to illustrate it here. And that is to use parentheses as shown here, and that this is equivalent to float FL equals 3.14. And just to confirm, we'll do a quick printout of that value. That works for any type. I guess let's put a couple other types. CH, the character R, integer I, 392, and so on and so forth. So I can print out FL, CH, and I. And just to show that that method of initializing a variable when you create it works. And there we go. All right. So what I've done is I've created a class that we can take a quick look at. Up here, I call it stooge, and here's the header file or the class declaration for stooge, and it has two private variables, which is the name of the stooge, and then grade is just a character representing whether they basically just rating their popularity or famousness or something like that. As far as the public functions, there are only two here. One is a display function, which will output these two. We'll look at that momentarily. And then the other is the constructor, which always has the exact same name as the class. So the name of the function is stooge. You'll also note absent from the constructor is any return type. When you create a stooge, there's nothing being returned. You're just actually bringing it into existence, so no return type is allowed, not even the word void, so it stands alone. And then what I'm providing here are the pieces of information required to create a stooge. And I'm going to add I'm going to leave it like that. Actually, what I will do is I'm going to remove this. We're going to look at how we might initialize grade momentarily. So all we're going to provide is a name, and the thing about stooges is they're always grade A funny. Okay, so they're always funny. So I don't actually we don't know the name of the stooge when we create the stooge, so we provide that information, but there's no need to provide the grade because it'll always be A. And so I'll show you how we do that with the constructor here in just a moment. Let me come down here and bring up the source code, and this would be the class definition, which is the definition of each of the member functions. I did make this modification, remove that. And since the grade is always A, I can do something like that. There's no need for me to pass it in. I always just set it to A. And then the display shouldn't be any surprises. Print out the name, we say is a grade, print out the letter, stooge. And then I'll come up here, and I wrote a very simple test program. We include the class declaration. I create a stooge. I'm not going to provide the grade. I just provide the name, and then we should see it display. So I'll come down here and we'll give it a compile. And we have to put all of the CPP files involved in the application here in the absence of a make file. We'll run it, and there it is. Mo is a grade A stooge. So we created it right here, giving it the name Mo. This is going to run the constructor function that we've defined right here. So the name Mo comes into NM, gets assigned to the stooge's name, and then the letter A is always assigned to the grade. Let's create a class that is actually comprised of stooges. So what we'll do is, I think we'll come up here, and I'm going to create a class, let's call it troupe, as in a comedy troupe. Class troupe, private, and the comedy troupe always consists of 3 stooges. The first, middle, and last stooge, we'll call them. And we'll have a couple functions here. One is we want to once again construct our troupe, and we're just going to pass in 3 strings. So I'll say nm1, nm2, and nm3, so that the names of our 3 stooges. And then we'll go ahead, and we don't really have an application where we're using this, so we're kind of making up the functions we'll need. I'll just say that we have a display function. We'll leave it at that. Put in my header guards. And we're dealing with strings, so I will say include string, and so that I don't have to say std : string everywhere, I will add this as well. I think that pretty much does it. Let's come down here and create the definition for our troupe. So there are 2 functions we're going to have to write. One is the constructor. Oh, I guess let's go ahead and take care of the bookkeeping here. We have to include troupe.h. I also know that I'm going to want to include IOStream. Maybe actually, let me see, do I need to? Yeah, we'll do it. Using name, we'll just include the whole namespace here. And now let's write the definition for a function. So I'm going to write the display function first. It's a little bit easier to get our head wrapped around. Void display. And we have to say that this function is part of the troupe class. So before the name of the function, I say troupe : and then we need to display each of the 3 stooges. So first I'll give kind of a header and say I give you our comedy troupe. End line. And now I want the first stooge to display to the screen, and this middle, and finally the last. And I think that's all there is to that. Next, we have to write the constructor. So the name of the constructor is troupe. We'll fill that in a moment. Again, we have to say that this function belongs to the troupe class. So I precede the name of the function by the name of the class : just as I did right here. And now I fill this in. This is actually going to be identical to what I have up on line 11 right above me in the class declaration. nm1 string nm2 string nm3. Alright. I'm going to leave it empty at the moment, and I'm going to try and compile this, and it's going to fail. So let me come over to here, and let's just give a test compile so that we can see what problems it complains about. Okay, first I need to, up on here, first let me fix one thing. Since we're dealing with stooges here, it's saying it doesn't know what a stooge is. That's easily solved. All we have to do is say #include stooge.h. So let's try it again. I clear this, compile. Let me zoom in. Looks like I have some miscellaneous errors here. Expecting a semicolon. Let me get rid of that. So I just have some simple errors I need to kind of get out of the way so we can look at the problem I want to focus in on. Hopefully third time's the charm. Let me zoom in this. We'll try compiling. Oh, a whole bunch here. And I believe they're all the same. Yes, they are. So there's the where I compile, and looking at the error, it's saying it's complaining about constructors, and so it's a little bit, it's complaining about not being able to initialize first, not being able to initialize middle, and not being able to initialize last. So let me, a little bit of an esoteric error message, but let me go ahead and draw your attention to what precisely the compiler is complaining about. What's happened over here is that I've said the way you create a stooge is by giving it a name. And that is what the constructor is specifying in this case on line 11, and then of course the source for it is down in the CPP file. Once I create a constructor, and you can create more than one constructor, by the way. Let's say, oh, I don't know, this is nonsensical because there is neither a float nor an integer that the stooge needs to deal with here, but just showing you that I could have more than one constructor. So I could either create a stooge by giving it a name, or I could create a stooge by giving it an integer, a float, and a name. So setting that aside, we only have the one constructor, so there is only one way of creating a stooge, and that is by providing it a name when you create it. And that's the key phrase: when you create it, you have to provide it a name. Coming back to what I started out with, here I'm creating a float by giving it a floating point number. I'm initializing a character by giving it an R. I would do the same thing with a stooge. I would say stooge, whatever I call it, and then I would give it a name. Right, that's the only way that I can create a stooge, is by providing it a name, because that's what the constructors do, is they specify what are the only legal ways in which you're allowed to create a stooge. All right, so why is that then a problem over here? And the reason that's a problem is an early attempt that people do to try and resolve this, looking up here. You have first, middle, and last as our stooges that we have to initialize. Well, if we have to give it a name, can we do first? And then we give it nm1, as I specified right here, right, for the three names. So there's this. Whoops. And last. And this actually doesn't work. And in fact, you may, based on what I did in that starting out, you may say, well, maybe you can do it this way. And this doesn't work either. And the reason it doesn't work is because by the time you hit this open curly brace, the three stooges, first, middle, and last, already exist. Right here on line 7, they already exist, so it's too late to initialize it as you create it. You have to initialize it as you create it because it's already created. And as an example to prove that, it is perfectly fine for me to say, well, actually, yeah, I'll put it here. Let's say for whatever reason I wanted to call the display function, right? We would all agree that the variable first has to exist in order for line 7 to work. So it doesn't matter what you do on line 7, it already exists and it's too late. So the question is, well, how in the world then do I provide these names here to our stooges to get them initialized while they're being created? And that is the purpose of an initialization list. It is to initialize, it is to provide an initial value to a variable as it is being created. And which variables? Specifically the private variables of the class, so these three. So the syntax is you put after this closing parenthesis, right there, after that closing parenthesis, and before this open curly brace, you put a colon. Now just list out the private data. So looking up in the pane right above me, my private data is first, middle, and last. So just list them. First, just put empty parentheses for now. This is kind of a recipe to follow. Comma, middle, comma, last. And that's all there is to it. You just simply, each of the pieces of private data, list them, put parentheses after them, separate the whole thing by commas. That's an initialization list. Now the only thing left is, well, what do you put in the parentheses? And in this case, we want to put nm1, nm2, and nm3 into each of these. So nm1 is going to be the first stooge. First stooge gets the first name, the middle stooge gets the second name, and the last stooge gets the third name. Now, so I can get rid of all this now. So when you call this constructor, which was, let's see, we don't have a code for it yet. So when you call this constructor, as first, middle, and last are being created, they'll be created using this information here. Now when you hit this line of code, first, middle, and last already exist, and they've already been initialized with values, which is really nice and convenient. Let's go ahead and write a little bit of an application that uses our troupe. So I will call it comedy. And let me go ahead and put in kind of my template for a main function here. We need to include troupe.h. And now, how do we create one? As shown on line 5, directly to my right, on the right side of the screen, is the syntax for the constructor, which is to give it 3 names. So I will create a troupe. I will call it, I don't know, a laugh factory. And of course I'm going to go with Mo, Larry, and Curly, providing 3 strings as shown over on line 5 there. Okay, and then what we can do is we can display our laugh factory after I've created it. Dot display, and I think that might actually work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take over this one here and try it. So I want to compile with troupe and stooge. All of the CPP files involved in my application have to be compiled. And what am I missing here? I've got you see I have a typo there. I have MN instead of NM. So I just transposed 2 letters by accident, and that is going to be in my bottom right hand corner. So there, I'll just switch those 2 letters real quickly and then come back up here. We'll try it again. And there we go. Let's try running it. Mo is a grade A stooge, Larry is a grade A stooge, Curly is a grade A stooge. Okay, so there on pane 3, this is again the initialization list, and in fact this is the preferred way to initialize all private data. We have to do it for stooge, but other things like character or string, we don't have to do it this way. But it's generally good style to do it whenever possible. So what we can do is go back to our excuse me, our original stooge class. And note there's no, here's the stooge constructor. Let me actually zoom in, get that front and center. Here's the stooge constructor, and there's no initialization list. Let's add an initialization list. So we follow the pattern, which is to put a colon, and now we list all of the private data members with parentheses. So there are 2 private data members, name and grade. That's all there is, just the 2 for stooge. In fact, let me go ahead and come back out. I'm down here, and let me come up top and bring up the class declaration, the header file, so we can just see. So again, 2 private data, name and grade. I put name and grade here. Now we just need to know what to put in the parentheses. What are we initializing name with? What are we initializing grade with? We're initializing name with this variable right here, nm. And then recall that a grade 100% of the time is A. So I'll just actually put the letter A there. And now we no longer need this. This is all redundant now, so I just delete that. And there we go. We have that constructor and initialization list completed. Let's quit out of here. Let's try compiling. Let's see, where was I compiling? I think up here. Yes. Let me zoom in, clear the screen, compile, run, and there you go. The whole thing works with initialization lists and constructors.